In Maine, the designer woman worked through an adjustment while the rich man said nothing. The morning in Maine held its color. Not bright, not dark, just enough light to show what was already there. Iris Calder stood inside the shop, close to the front window, adjusting the display she had finished the night before. A fold of fabric leaned a fraction to the left. She corrected it with 2 fingers, then stepped back. The glass reflected the street behind her. The road was damp from an earlier mist. A gull crossed the frame and disappeared. Across the street, Caleb Rowan stood still. He was not waiting for the door to open. He was not crossing. He was not turning away. He remained where he was, hands loose at his sides, coat zipped against the cold air coming off the water. From that distance, he could see the window clearly. The fabric, the light, the way Iris moved with small, exact motions as though the space listened to her. Someone passed between them. A woman with a canvas tote walked through the frame, then slowed. She noticed the alignment without knowing why. A man inside a shop window. A man across the street, neither moving toward the other, neither signaling. The moment stayed intact long enough to be seen. Iris did not look up right away. Caleb did not raise a hand. The town had already woken. A delivery truck idled near the corner. A bell rang once from the harbor, low and practical. The smell of salt carried in, then drifted away. The street did not pause for the stillness, but it did not interrupt it either. Inside the shop, Iris shifted the lighting by a few degrees. The change was barely visible, but it altered the window's depth. She took a step to the side. The reflection adjusted. Caleb's outline remained where it was. He had been back for less than a day. No one announced it. No one needed to. His presence was not dramatic. He did not arrive with luggage piled high or stories to share. He had walked from the edge of town that morning, following a route he already knew. The road curved where it always had. The boards along the storefronts creaked the same way underfoot. Across the street, a pickup slowed. The driver glanced once, then drove on. Iris finally looked up. Her eyes met the glass first, not the man. The reflection showed the street, the sky, the faint movement of clouds. Then she saw him clearly, standing where the reflection ended. There was no change in her posture, no interruption in her work. She held his gaze for the length of one breath, then another. The fabric behind her did not shift. The window stayed as it was. She did not smile. She did not look away quickly. Caleb remained where he stood. The moment did not ask anything of either of them. It did not explain itself. It simply existed, framed by glass and distance in a town that had learned how to hold quiet things without comment. Another passerby noticed. This one did not slow down. Still, the noticing happened. It always did. Being seen did not mean being addressed. Being present did not require permission. The gull returned, calling once above the roofs. The sound thinned as it moved inland. Iris turned back to the window and adjusted a single edge. Caleb shifted his weight just enough to stay warm. Nothing else changed. And yet, the alignment had already been set. The town did not announce itself. It revealed itself by staying the same. Morning settled in layers. A thin fog clung to the water first, then loosened its grip as the light shifted. The air carried salt and cold together, damp enough to settle into coats and wood. Winter light moved slowly here. It did not flood the streets. It rested on them. The road curved along the shoreline, following a line decided long before asphalt. Wooden houses stood close to one another, weathered but steady. Their paint had faded in different decades. Some leaned slightly toward the sea, as though listening. Porch steps creaked, even when no one stood on them. Down at the dock, the water moved in a steady rhythm. Not violent, not gentle enough to ignore. Waves touched the pilings, withdrew, then returned again. Nets hung to dry, stiff with salt. A skiff bumped softly against the side of the pier, its rope already worn smooth by repetition. Caleb Rowan walked past the harbor without stopping. His pace matched the town. Neither rushed nor delayed. He knew where the boards dipped, where the surface grew slick after rain. The wind came off the water and pressed against his coat. It carried the sound of gulls, distant and spaced apart, never frantic. A fisherman knelt near a crate, repairing a tear in a net. The motion was familiar. Needle through rope. Pull. Tighten. The man did not look up as Caleb passed. The sound of work continued unchanged. Further inland, the shops opened one by one. A cafe unlocked its door and set out a chalkboard sign that would not be updated until the afternoon. The grocery store lights flickered on. Someone inside swept the entryway, pushing yesterday's grit back into the street where it belonged. Iris called her shop sat between a hardware store and a closed bookstore. The windows were clean. The display inside was restrained. Fabric, light, space. Nothing crowded. Nothing explained. She moved within it quietly. Her work did not stop when the town shifted from morning to day. She adjusted, stepped back, adjusted again. The fog thinned outside. The glass changed with it. Reflections sharpened. The interior held steady. Across the street, footprints darkened the pavement where mist had settled earlier. A light drizzle passed through, barely enough to register. It left the air heavier. The sky remained gray, not threatening, simply present. A passerby paused near the corner, looking toward the water. The pause did not signal anything. It was a habit more than a choice. From that spot, the curve of the road, the dock, and the shop windows lined up in a way the town allowed only from certain angles. The alignment existed for a moment. Then it passed. The library sat a few blocks away, its brick darkened by moisture. Inside, the heat was low. Pages turned softly. Someone replaced a book without sound. The town favored places where voices stayed low, even when no rule required it. Caleb continued walking. He did not carry a map. He did not search for landmarks. His familiarity was quiet, like muscle memory. The post office stood where it always had. The bench beside it remained empty, damp from the air. A notice board held the same flyers from last week. At the edge of the street, a path led back toward the shore. It narrowed, then opened again. Driftwood lay scattered along the sand, pale against the darker ground. The sea lions were there that morning, resting in a loose cluster. They lifted their heads as he approached, then settled again. Caleb stopped a short distance away. He stood with his hands in his pockets, facing the water. The seals breathed, slow and visible. The waves continued their pattern. No one acknowledged the stillness, but it remained. Back in town, Iris closed the door of her shop for a short break. The bell did not ring. She walked toward the cafe without looking into the street first. The road curved gently ahead of her. The wind moved her scarf, then let it fall. Inside the cafe, mugs warmed the counter. Steam rose and faded. Conversation stayed low, not secretive, just unhurried. Iris ordered what she always did. The barista nodded once. No questions followed. From the window, the harbor was visible again, framed differently. The light shifted across the water, silvering the surface for a brief span before clouds moved in front of it. Someone at a nearby table noticed the change without turning their head. The town allowed that kind of noticing. Outside, the drizzle stopped. The air remained wet. Footsteps sounded softer on the pavement. The gulls called again, farther apart now. Their voices stretched thin by distance. Caleb turned back toward the street as the morning moved on. Nothing in Maine asked to be understood quickly. Nothing needed to be claimed. The quiet world held its shape, rough at the edges, steady within. Caleb Rowan woke before the town showed any sign of movement. The sky outside his window was still gray, not yet divided into morning and day. The air held the cold from the night. He sat up without checking the time. The routine did not require it. He crossed the small room and opened the window just enough to let the sound in. The ocean reached him before the light did. Waves met the shore in a steady rhythm, close enough to hear, far enough to remain unchanged by listening. The air carried salt and moisture. It settled on the wooden frame, on his hands on the floor beneath. He left the window open. In the kitchen, the light stayed off. He filled the kettle from the tap and set on the stove. The sound of water heating joined the quiet rather than interrupting it. When it was ready, he poured slowly into the French press. Coffee bloomed, dark against the glass, releasing a smell that filled the small space without lingering. He waited. The waiting was part of it. When he poured the coffee into a mug, he did not carry it far. He stood near the window and drank without distraction. The surface of the ocean shifted with the wind. The sky lightened by degrees. Nothing marked the change except time itself. Afterward, he sat at the table and opened a notebook. The pages were plain. He wrote a few lines, then stopped. He sketched the curve of the shoreline, the angle of a dock piling, the way light had touched the water earlier in the week. The drawings were not finished. They did not need to be. He closed the notebook and placed it back where it belonged. Outside, the town began to move. Caleb put on his coat and stepped out. The air felt heavier now, damp but calm. He walked toward the shore, following the same path he had taken the day before and the day before that. His steps matched the uneven ground. He did not look down. Along the beach, a group of sea lions rested near the waterline. Their bodies rose and fell with their breathing. They shifted slightly as he approached, then settled again. Caleb sat on a low rock a short distance away. He faced the water, hands resting on his knees. He stayed. Fishing boats moved farther out, their engines low and constant. Nets were hauled, lines checked, gestures exchanged without words. The work carried on with practiced ease. Caleb watched without signaling. The fishermen did not look toward shore. When he stood again, the sea lions did not move. Later, back in town, he stopped at a small repair shop. A coat lay folded on the counter, its lining exposed. He took it with him to the workbench in his room. The tear was small. He threaded a needle and stitched slowly, pulling the fabric tight, releasing it again. The repair did not show when he finished. He placed the coat back by the door. At midday, he walked to the diner near the corner. The bell above the door sounded once when he entered. The woman behind the counter nodded. No menu changed hands. He took a seat by the window. Outside, the street curved toward the harbor. A truck passed, then another. Someone crossed the road carrying a bag of groceries. The light shifted again, softer now, filtered through thin cloud cover. His plate arrived. He ate at an even pace. When he finished, he left cash on the table and stood. The woman behind the counter glanced at it, then back to the grill. From there, he went to the grocery store. He picked up what he needed without pausing. The shelves remained in the same order. The cashier greeted him with a brief look, nothing more. The transaction ended as it began. At the library, he returned a book and took another from the shelf. He sat for a while at one of the wooden tables, reading without turning many pages. The room held a quiet that did not demand silence. Chairs shifted. Pages turned. Someone coughed once and did not apologize. In the afternoon, the wind picked up. Clouds moved faster across the sky. Caleb returned home and closed the window he had left open earlier. The sound of the ocean softened but did not disappear. He placed the groceries away, then stepped back outside. Along the edge of the harbor, he found a length of driftwood and carried it to a small boat pulled up near the sand. The hull showed signs of wear. He sanded a rough patch, then applied a thin layer of sealant. The work took time. He did not rush it. When he finished, he washed his hands in cold water and stood looking out at the sea again. The wind pressed against his coat. The clouds thickened, then thinned. Light moved across the surface of the water in narrow bands. As evening came on, he walked to the bar near the end of the street. The room was dim, lit by a few low lamps. He took a seat at the end of the counter and ordered one drink. He sipped it slowly, listening to the murmur of conversation around him without following any of it. When he left, the air outside had cooled further. The street was quieter now. He walked home with his hands in his pockets. On Sunday mornings, his routine shifted slightly. He dressed and walked toward the church at the edge of town. The building was old. Its wood darkened with age. Inside, the light fell in long, narrow lines across the floor. Caleb entered and took a seat in the back pew. He did not join the congregation. He did not bow his head. He sat still, hands resting on the bench beside him. The service continued at a distance. Words rose and fell. Music filled the space, then faded. No prayers were spoken by him. No doctrine followed. Only wood, light, and the back pew. When he left, the door closed softly behind him. The fog had returned by then, rolling in from the water. Caleb walked along the shoreline once more, his figure moving in and out of view as the mist shifted. He stopped where the beach narrowed and stood there for a long time. The town did not change its pace around him. Routine held its place, not as a shield, not as a statement, but as a way of remaining. The town did not mark Iris Calder's arrival. She was already there, in the way some people are, folded into the rhythm of a place rather than introduced to it. Her shop sat a short walk from the harbor, between a hardware store and a narrow building that had once been something else. The wooden sign above the door showed signs of weather, its paint softened by salt and years. Inside, the space was quiet but not still. Iris moved with small, deliberate motions. She adjusted a dress form by a fraction of an inch, stepped back, then moved it again. Fabric lay across a long table, folded with care rather than precision. Light from a window reached the floor in a pale band and stopped there. She worked without urgency. People in town passed the window and glanced in, then continued on. Some nodded. Some did not. No one paused to ask questions. The shop was part of the street now, the way the dock was part of the waterline. Caleb Rowan first noticed her there, not because she drew attention, but because she did not. He passed the shop on his usual route back from the harbor. The fog had thinned, leaving the air cold and clear. Through the glass, he saw her adjusting the angle of the lamp so that the light fell differently across the table. She did not look up. He did not stop. The next day, she was there again. This time, the door stood open, held by a small weight at its base. The bell above it did not ring in the wind. Iris knelt near the threshold, repairing the edge of a rug that had begun to curl. Her hands moved steadily. The thread matched the fabric so closely that the repair disappeared as she worked. A delivery truck pulled up across the street. Someone called her name. She lifted one hand in response without turning her head. Caleb passed again, carrying a length of driftwood under his arm. She glanced up briefly, just long enough to see him, then returned to her work. No expression changed. No signal followed. It was enough. Later that week, their paths crossed closer. At the grocery store, Iris stood near the shelves, comparing two spools of thread by touch rather than sight. Caleb waited a short distance away for her to finish. When she stepped aside, she nodded once, an acknowledgement without weight. "Morning," she said. "Morning," he replied. Nothing more was required. At the library, she occupied the table near the window, papers spread neatly in front of her. She worked with a pencil, erasing more often than she wrote. Caleb returned a book at the counter and selected another. When he turned, she had already gathered her things and stood. They left at the same time, walking in the same direction for half a block before separating without comment. The town registered this the way it registered most things, quietly. Iris was known here. She had repaired sails for fishermen who did not ask her background. She had altered coats and dresses without remark. When something did not fit, she fixed it. When it did, she said nothing. One afternoon, Caleb stopped at her shop. The decision did not feel like one. The door was open. The light inside was softer than the light outside. Iris stood at the table, measuring a length of fabric. She looked up when he crossed the threshold, then set the tape down. He held out the coat he had repaired earlier. "The lining came loose," he said. She took it without comment and turned it inside out. Her fingers traced the seam. She nodded once. "Leave it here," she said. "It will be ready tomorrow." There was no question attached, no curiosity in her voice. He left the coat and stepped back outside. The next day it was ready. The repair was clean, invisible unless one knew where to look. Iris folded the coat and placed it on the counter. Caleb picked it up and weighed it in his hands, not checking the seam. "That works," he said. She inclined her head. He paid. She placed the money in the drawer without counting it. As he turned to leave, she spoke again. "The wind picks up later," she said. "The harbor side gets cold first." It was not advice. It was an observation. He nodded and left. From then on, they occupied the same spaces without making plans. Sometimes she walked the shoreline, stopping to collect small pieces of driftwood or rusted metal that caught her eye. Sometimes he passed by, carrying his tools, heading toward the boat he had been working on. Their paths crossed, then separated. They did not fall in a step. They did not avoid it either. The detail that marked Iris as safe was not what she said or did. It was what she did not reach for. She did not ask where Caleb had come from. She did not comment on his routine. She did not offer help where it was not needed. She stayed within her work, within the space she occupied. In town, this was noticed. Not discussed, not labeled, but noticed all the same. Two people moving alongside the same rhythm without disturbing it. A presence that did not press. One evening, as the fog rolled in again, Iris stood outside her shop, adjusting the sign so it hung straight. Caleb passed on the opposite side of the street. For a moment, they shared the same frame, seen from a distance by someone walking toward the harbor. Neither looked over. The street remained quiet. The first contact did not belong to either of them. It belonged to the space between. Late morning brought a thin mist off the water, not enough to hide the harbor, only enough to soften its edges. Caleb Rowan stood near the dock hardware bench, tightening a loose hinge on a storage box that was not his. He had not been asked. The lid had caught the wind earlier and bent the metal just enough to matter. He worked with his sleeves rolled down, movements measured. A few yards away, Iris Calder waited beside a stack of folded canvas, checking a short list written in pencil. She had brought the material for someone else. The list was brief. It did not include names. A third presence entered without announcement. Tom Beasley, who ran supply runs between the dock and the Maine road, stopped his truck nearby. He cut the engine and stepped down, boots hitting the planks with a familiar sound. He glanced at the box, then at Caleb. That hinge was sticking, Tom said. It closes now, Caleb replied. Tom nodded once and turned toward Iris. This yours? He asked, tapping the canvas. Yes, she said. It goes to the loft on Harbor Street. I will take it after lunch, Tom said. That works, Iris said. There was no follow-up. Tom lifted the canvas with care, testing the weight before committing to it. He set it back down and wiped his hands on his jacket. His eyes moved briefly between the two of them, not searching, just noticing. You both early today, he said. Caleb finished the last turn of the screw and straightened. Wind shifted, he said. Iris checked the sky, then nodded. Tom smiled, not broadly, just enough to mark the moment. I will be back, he said. He left the truck where it was and walked toward the diner. The dock settled again. Caleb stepped away from the box and reached for his tools. Iris folded her list and placed it in her pocket. They stood near each other without adjusting their distance. The hinge holds, she said. It should, he replied. That was all. A gull called from the far end of the pier. The sound echoed once, then disappeared into the fog. Someone farther down hammered a plank into place. The rhythm was steady, unremarked. When Tom returned, he carried 2 cups of coffee, lids pressed tight. He held one out, not looking directly at either of them. I grab an extra, he said. Caleb took it. Thanks, he said. Iris did not reach for the second cup. Tom set it down on the bench beside her canvas. She picked it up after a moment. Appreciated, she said. They drank without comment. No one asked how long anyone planned to stay. No one asked where they were headed next. Tom finished first and crushed his cup. I will load this now, he said, lifting the canvas again. Caleb stepped aside to clear the path. Iris adjusted the edge so it did not catch. Careful with the corner, she said. I see it, Tom replied. He secured the load and closed the truck bed. Before getting in, he looked at them again the same way he might look at a tide chart or the weather. Cold later, he said. So it goes, Caleb said. Tom drove off. The space they left behind did not fill immediately. Iris set her empty cup down and straightened the bench. Caleb placed his tools back into their roll. They worked parallel, not together. A passerby slowed briefly at the edge of the dock, watching the two of them without being seen. There was nothing to interpret, only activity that fit the morning. Iris lifted the folded canvas scraps and turned toward the road. I will be at the shop, she said. He nodded. I will be here, he replied. They parted without ceremony. From the road, someone glanced back once. The dock returned to its usual pattern. The contact had happened, and it had passed, leaving the arrangement intact. The shift did not arrive as a statement. It arrived as work that no one had requested. The morning carried a colder edge than the day before. The fog lifted early, leaving the harbor exposed and pale, boards still damp, rope darkened by salt. Caleb Rowan arrived before most of the town had fully woken. He did not head toward the dock where he usually stood. He crossed the road and stopped near the public notice board, the one mounted beside the old storage shed. One corner had come loose again. It had been like that for weeks. Everyone knew it. The board still functioned. Notices stayed pinned. The corners simply rattled when the wind came off the water. Caleb set his tool roll on the ground and knelt. He did not check for an audience. He did not look toward the diner windows. He loosened the warped screw, adjusted the bracket by a fraction, then reset it. The sound was small. Metal on wood. Once. Twice. Then silence. He wiped his hands on his jeans and stood. A woman passing with her dog slowed without stopping. She looked at the board, then at him, then continued walking. The dog did not pause. Across the street, Iris Calder unlocked her shop. She paused with the key still in her hand. The movement across the road had caught her eye. She watched long enough to register what he was doing, then turned the lock the rest of the way. Inside, she moved fabric aside, clearing space near the window. Obboltlund. At the wrong angle. She corrected it. Her reflection passed briefly through the glass, then disappeared. Back outside, Caleb moved to the shed door. One hinge sagged just enough to scrape the frame when the door closed. He lifted the door with his shoulder, slid a thin shim beneath the hinge, tightened the screws, and tested it once. The door closed cleanly. He left the shim in place. No one thanked him. A pickup truck pulled in and out of the parking space nearby. The driver noticed the shed, nodded to himself, and drove on. Later, a man from the bait shop stopped to pin a flyer to the board. He pressed the corner flat, realized it no longer bent, and frowned briefly, as if trying to recall something he had forgotten. He did not look for the person responsible. Caleb returned his tools to the roll and carried it under his arm. He did not linger to admire the result. He crossed the street again. Iris had opened the front of the shop to air out the space. The bell above the door chimed once when the breeze caught it. She stood on a low stool, adjusting the fall of a curtain inside the window. The fabric caught the light differently now, less glare, more depth. Caleb stopped short of the doorway. He did not enter. He shifted the stool slightly, nudging it with his foot so it stood square on the uneven floor. The movement was quiet, almost accidental. The stool steadied. He stepped back. Iris glanced down. "It is fine," she said. He nodded and moved away. She did not thank him. She did not ask him to stay. She adjusted the curtain again, tested the line with her fingers, then stepped down on her own. A passerby paused outside the shop, looking in. Not at Caleb. At the window. At the way the fabric framed the display. The passerby nodded once, satisfied, and continued on. By late morning, word had not spread. There was nothing to spread. At the dock, a coil of rope had been left where it could catch a boot heel. Caleb lifted it and re-hung it on its hook. He did not straighten the others. He did not reorganize the rack. One correction, then done. A fisherman noticed the cleared path and stepped through without comment. At the grocery, a loose basket wobbled near the entrance. Caleb adjusted the leg until it stopped rocking. A woman loading produce glanced at him, then at the basket. "Good," she said, more to the basket than to him. He stepped aside. No one offered him work. No one assumed he would continue. The town did not respond with gratitude. It responded with continuation. Around noon, Iris closed her shop for lunch. She crossed the street with a paper bag under her arm. Caleb sat on the bench near the water, eating slowly. She stopped a few feet away, not close enough to share the bench, not far enough to suggest distance. She ate standing. The wind picked up. A napkin lifted, slid across the boards, and caught under the bench. Iris watched it for a moment, then bent and retrieved it herself. She folded it and placed it back in a bag. Caleb did not move. "I will reopen in 15 minutes, she said, not looking at him. He nodded. "I will be gone by then," he replied. She did not comment on that. They finished eating without speaking again. When she returned to the shop, she noticed the stool standing square where it had not before. She moved it back to its usual place, slightly angled the way she preferred. The correction was small. Intentional. Caleb did not see it. Later that afternoon, a delivery truck blocked the alley behind the hardware store. The driver struggled with a crate, misjudged the turn, and scraped the wall. Caleb stepped forward, lifted one side of the crate just enough to clear the corner, then stepped back again. The driver managed to rest himself. "Thanks," the driver said, already turning away. Caleb picked up his tool roll and walked on. The shift became visible only in what did not happen. No one began asking him to fix things. No one treated him as a solution. He was not praised. He was not watched closely. His presence did not expand. It settled. Iris noticed the difference near dusk. The light in her shop had changed. The reflection from the street no longer cut across the counter the same way. She traced the source back to the notice board across the road, now sitting flush, no longer angled. The light traveled cleaner. She looked toward the bench by the water. Caleb was not there. She adjusted the display one last time, then turned off the lights and locked the door. As she walked away, she passed the shed. The door closed without scraping. She paused, touched the wood once, then withdrew her hand. She did not look for him. The town continued as it had before. Only the friction points had shifted. Not removed. Adjusted. The next days did not add weight. They added distance. Caleb Rowan kept his routine. He arrived at the same hours, left at the same hours, took the same paths through town. What changed was not where he went, but where his eyes paused. At the dock, he no longer stood facing the water alone. He stood angled, aware of movement behind him. Boots on planks. A crate set down. A voice calling a name that was not his. None of it required response. All of it registered. Across the street, Iris Calder worked with the door open again. The bell moved with the breeze. Not enough to ring fully, just enough to whisper metal against metal. She adjusted the same section of fabric she had adjusted the day before. The change was minimal. The repetition was not. She sensed him before she saw him. Not because he stared. He did not. Because the absence of motion held longer than usual. A stillness that stayed put. She did not look up immediately. When she did, their eyes met for less than a second. Long enough to confirm position. Not long enough to invite anything further. Caleb looked away first. He did not cross the street. The distance between them stayed measured, like space between lines on a chart. Close enough to track. Far enough to remain separate. Later that morning, Iris carried a rolled length of fabric from the back room to the front. The bolt was heavier than it looked. She shifted her grip once, adjusted the angle, and continued without stopping. Caleb noticed the adjustment. He stepped closer to the curb, then stopped. His hand stayed at his sides. He did not reach out. He did not call to her. The moment passed on its own. She set the fabric down. The weight landed cleanly. Neither acknowledged what had almost happened. A gull cried overhead. The sound cut sharply, then faded. The harbor returned to its steady rhythm. Water against wood. Rope against post. In the afternoon, a light rain moved through. Not enough to clear the street. Not enough to soak the ground. Just enough to change how sound traveled. Caleb stood under the awning near the hardware store, watching the rain darken the boards. Iris closed her door halfway, leaving a gap for light and air. They were not looking at each other. They were looking through the same space. A man passed between them, head down, collar up. Another followed, slower. The space held. Iris adjusted the door again, this time closing it fully. The bell rang once. Clear. Final. Caleb stepped back from the awning. The rain stopped. In the quiet that followed, he felt the tension not as pressure, but as delay. A held beat. Something waiting for nothing in particular. At the grocery, they crossed paths in the narrow aisle near the dry goods. A cart blocked part of the way. Iris paused. Caleb paused opposite her. The space between them was less than 3 feet. She glanced at the shelf behind him. "Excuse me," she said. He stepped aside immediately. No hosetaschen. No comment. She reached for the item, took it, and nodded once in acknowledgement. Not thanks. Not dismissal. He nodded back. Their eyes met again, briefly. This time, neither looked away first. The moment did not expand. It ended on its own. A clerk cleared his throat nearby. The world resumed. That evening, the fog came in thick and low. Visibility shortened. Sound carried closer. Footsteps felt nearer than they were. Caleb walked the long way home along the water. Iris stayed late, lights still on inside the shop. Through the fog, he saw the glow before the shape. A square of warm light, steady, unchanged. He stopped at the edge of the street. She was visible through the glass, hands moving, precise, measuring, pinning, unpinning, repeating the same motion until it aligned. She did not look up. He stayed where he was. The tension settled into the space between action and restraint, between habit and interruption. Neither crossed it. A passerby moved behind Caleb and slowed. Noticed the light. Noticed the man standing still. The passerby continued on. Inside the shop, Iris paused. Her hands rested on the counter. She exhaled, slow and even, then returned to her work. Outside, Caleb matched the pace without knowing it. His shoulders dropped slightly. His breath slowed to match the rhythm of the water. Nothing was decided. Nothing was resolved. The distance held because both kept it intact. When Iris finally turned off the light and locked the door, Caleb was no longer there. She stood for a moment on the empty sidewalk, listening. The fog muffled everything. She adjusted her scarf and walked home. The town absorbed the quiet without comment. The tension did not disappear. It simply learned how to wait. Morning returned without announcement. The fog lifted early, leaving the harbor exposed and pale. Boards dried slowly. Nets hung heavy with salt. The town resumed its pace, unchanged on the surface. Caleb Rowan walked his usual route along the water. The path curved the same way it always had. The distance from the dock to the corner store remained just under half a mile. His steps followed that measure without counting. Ahead, Iris Calder stood outside her shop, door open wide this time. She was not working yet. She was simply there, sleeves rolled, hands resting at her sides as the air moved through the space. Caleb slowed when he noticed her. Not to stop, just enough to mark her position. She saw him approach and stayed where she was. The space between them closed naturally, not by intention, but by shared direction. When he reached the storefront, she shifted one step back, leaving room. He nodded once. She returned it. Neither spoke. They walked together for the length of the block, side by side but not aligned. Their strides did not match perfectly. One step slightly ahead than the other. The difference held. At the end of the block, the street split. One path led toward the pier. The other climbed gently toward the residential stretch. Caleb paused at the corner. Iris paused as well. The moment did not ask for explanation. It asked for clarity. He turned toward the pier. She continued uphill. The separation was clean. No delay. No glance back. Later, near midday, the town library opened its side door to air out the building. Iris stepped inside briefly, then out again, carrying a stack of thin boards wrapped in twine. She adjusted the load once and kept walking. Caleb saw her from across the street. He crossed without hurry and stopped a few feet away. "The twine looks loose," he said. She looked down, then back at him. "It is." He reached out, then stopped short, hand suspended between them. The distance remained intact. She lifted the bundle slightly. "You can tighten it." He nodded and stepped closer. His hands worked quickly, efficiently. The knot held. He stepped back as soon as it was done. "Thank you," she said. He inclined his head. Nothing more. As she turned to leave, she paused. Not long enough to change direction. Long enough to add one sentence. "You do not have to answer yet," she said, looking ahead rather than at him. The words settled without emphasis. Not a request. Not a question. Simply placed. He did not respond. She walked on. That afternoon, the wind picked up along the water. Flags snapped. Doors closed more firmly than usual. Inside her shop, Iris shifted a work table closer to the window. Light fell differently across the surface. She adjusted her layout by inches, not feet. Caleb passed by once. Then again, later. Both times he slowed, then continued. At dusk, they found themselves near the same stretch of shoreline, separated by a line of rocks. The tide was low. Kelp lay exposed, dark and slick. Caleb stood on one side, hands in his pockets. Iris on the other, sketchbook resting against her thigh. They were close enough to speak without raising their voices. They did not. A fisherman passed behind them, dragging a crate. He nodded to both. They acknowledged him separately. The boundary held, not as distance, but as agreement. When the light faded, Iris closed her book. She stepped back from the rocks. "I'm heading back," she said. Caleb nodded. "I will stay." She did not ask where. He did not explain. They parted again, each taking a different path. Not away from each other, just not together. The town lights came on one by one. Windows glowed. The harbor settled. Nothing had been promised. Nothing had been withdrawn. The trust was small, barely visible, like a mark in wet sand that stayed only because the tide had not reached it yet. The town accepted the shape of it and moved on. The day shifted in small ways, none of them announced. A supply truck arrived late at the dock, tires hissing against wet gravel. Someone shouted a number. Someone else answered without looking up. The routine absorbed the delay and kept moving. Caleb Rowan stood near the bait shed, waiting for the path to clear. He was not part of the unloading. He was simply there, leaning against the post where the paint had peeled to bare wood. A gull dropped low, then lifted again. Across the lot, Iris called her crossed with a narrow ladder balanced on her shoulder. She had wrapped the ends in cloth so they would not chip the door frames inside her shop. She adjusted her grip once, then kept going. The wind shifted quick and sharp. The ladder tilted. A hand nearby reached up instinctively, then stopped short. Caleb watched the ladder wobble. He did not move. Iris corrected herself, feet widening slightly, weight settling. The ladder steadied. She continued walking, pace unchanged. No one commented. The moment passed, as if it had not been there. Later, the sky brightened enough to thin the fog, but not clear it. Shapes appeared and softened again. The ferry horn sounded once, long and low, then cut off. Caleb walked the edge of the pier, checking boards by habit rather than purpose. One plank creaked louder than the others. He stepped over it without stopping. A coil of rope lay loose near the end. Not his, not assigned. He bent, looped it twice, and set it closer to the piling so it would not slide. He did not tie it. He did not look around to see who might notice. A fisherman passed a few minutes later, glanced down, and nudged the rope with his boot into a better position. He nodded once, to no one in particular, and kept walking. In the afternoon, Iris worked with the shop door open again. The sound of the street entered without asking. She moved a shelf 2 inches to the left, then stopped. Moved it back 1 inch. The change held. A customer came in, asked about hinges. She answered, retrieved a box, set it on the counter. The exchange ended where it began. Outside, Caleb paused long enough to let a delivery van back into place. He stepped aside, then resumed his walk. The same route, the same distance. Near the post office, a paper bag split at the bottom. Oranges rolled out, scattering toward the curb. The person carrying it froze, hands full, unsure which direction to move first. Caleb reached the nearest orange and stopped it with the side of his shoe. He picked it up and set it on the edge of the bag, steadying the torn seam without pressing. Iris arrived at the same moment from the opposite side. She knelt, gathered 2 oranges, and placed them gently into the bag, turning it so the weight balanced differently. She stood first. He stood after. "Thank you," the person said to both of them. They nodded separately. The bag was lifted. The street returned to its pattern. Neither Caleb nor Iris spoke as they continued in opposite directions. The brief alignment dissolved without friction. By early evening, the temperature dropped again. Jackets appeared. Doors closed more firmly. Inside the bar near the harbor, glasses clinked softly. Caleb sat at the end, same stool, hands resting flat on the counter. He ordered the same drink. The bartender slid it over without comment. At the far table, Iris sat with 2 others, sketches spread between them. She listened more than she spoke. A pencil rolled and nearly fell. She caught it before it hit the floor. Across the room, someone laughed too loudly, then apologized. The sound faded. Outside, rain began without commitment. A light mist, barely enough to mark the pavement. It stopped again, just as quietly. When Iris left, she pulled her collar up and stepped into the streetlight. Caleb followed a minute later, keeping his distance. They walked the same direction for half a block, not together, not apart. At the crosswalk, a car slowed too late. Tires skidded slightly, then stopped short. The driver raised a hand in apology. Caleb had already stepped back. Iris had not moved at all. The light changed. They crossed. Near the corner, Iris's bag slipped from her shoulder and dropped. Paper slid partway out, edges catching the damp. Caleb bent and lifted the bag before it tipped further. He held it out, careful not to look inside. She took it and adjusted the strap. "That was close," she said, not to him, but to the moment. He nodded. They stood there a second longer than required, traffic passing behind them, the town breathing around them. Then she turned toward her street. He continued on. The near moments accumulated without ceremony. No rescue completed. No credit assigned. Only small corrections. Small courtesies. Movements that kept the town in balance without changing its shape. The night settled. Lights reflected on wet asphalt. The harbor went quiet again. Caleb reached his door and paused, listening to the sound of the water through the boards. Somewhere across town, Iris closed her shop and locked the door, the click barely audible. The day ended as it had moved through itself, leaving behind nothing dramatic, only the sense that things had been handled, just enough by more than one pair of hands. Morning returned without announcement. The fog lifted unevenly, leaving the harbor half clear, half held. The same boats, the same ropes. One detail sat wrong, small enough to miss. At the far end of the dock, a man mentioned, casually, that Iris Calder had moved the shelves again. He said it as if it explained something else. The comment was not directed. It landed and stayed where it fell. Someone nearby nodded, misunderstanding the point but accepting the shape of it. By the time Caleb Rowan arrived, the sentence had already settled into the air, stripped of tone. It had become a detail rather than a judgment. He walked past the bait shed, paused at the edge of the water, and listened. The boards were damp. The smell of salt and diesel mixed as usual. A fisherman farther down the pier looked up and said, "Looks different over there," gesturing vaguely toward the street. Caleb followed the gesture with his eyes. He did not ask which part. "Different is fine," he said evenly. The fisherman shrugged, just saying, that was all. Across town, Iris unlocked her shop and stepped inside. She stopped when she saw the shelves. They were exactly where she had left them. Still, the phrase returned to her, out of context now. "Looks different." She ran her hand along the edge of the nearest shelf, checking its alignment. Straight. Solid. She adjusted nothing. Mid-morning, a woman came in looking for picture hooks. She hesitated in the doorway longer than usual. "Did you change something?" she asked. Iris waited a second before answering. "Not today." The woman nodded, uncertain, then smiled as if that solved it. She bought the hooks and left. Outside, the street moved on. Caleb stopped by the post office, then the hardware store. At the counter, someone slid a small box toward him, then paused. "You're staying through the month?" the clerk asked. Caleb looked up. "Yes." The clerk nodded. "Thought so." There was a beat where something else could have been said. It was not. By afternoon, the wrong detail had shifted again. It lost its subject. Someone mentioned that the shop felt quieter now. Someone else repeated it later, without meaning the same thing. The words traveled, thinning as they went. No one treated it as news. Caleb passed Iris on the street, near the corner cafe. She was carrying a rolled set of plans under her arm, careful to keep them dry. He slowed slightly. She noticed, then matched the change. They walked half a block at the same pace, not side by side, not separate enough to break the line. A delivery truck idled ahead, blocking the crosswalk. They waited. "I heard you might be leaving," Iris said, not looking at him. He turned his head a fraction. "That is not accurate." She nodded once. "That makes sense." The truck moved. They crossed. Nothing else followed the exchange. The sentence remained as it was, uncorrected, not discussed further. At the cafe, a table scraped. A cup broke, cleanly, without shattering. Someone bent to collect the pieces. Caleb reached for a napkin and handed it over. The gesture was small, complete. Later, Iris sat at her work table, redrawing a line she had already drawn twice. She stopped before the third attempt. Outside her window, Caleb stood with a man from the marina, listening more than speaking. The man pointed toward the water, then toward the road. Caleb nodded once. When Iris noticed them, she did not look away quickly. She watched long enough to understand there was no performance happening, just time being used. In the early evening, rain returned, steady but light. The town adjusted without comment. At the bar, the bartender placed Caleb's glass down and said, "You are part of the furniture now." It was meant lightly. It landed heavier than intended. Caleb smiled, small and brief. Furniture can be moved. The bartender laughed, then quieted. True. At the far end of the room, Iris entered and paused, scanning for an open table. There was one near the window, half in shadow. Caleb did not wave. He shifted his chair slightly, making space at the end of the counter instead. She noticed. She chose the table anyway. The distance held. Outside, the rain softened. Reflections stretched along the pavement, blurring the edges of familiar things. When Iris left, she pulled her coat tighter and stepped into the evening. Caleb followed minutes later, timing his exit so the door would not close behind her too loudly. They walked the same direction again. At the corner, Iris slowed. "You do not need to correct everything," she said, still facing forward. He considered the words, not their meaning. "I do not," he agreed. She stopped there. He continued on. The wrong detail remained in circulation, unchanged, small enough to live with. It shifted the line between them by a single step. Not closer, not farther, just clearer. Morning moved more slowly after the rain. The harbor did not look different at first. The same gulls traced the air above the water. The same ropes knocked gently against the pilings. What had changed was not visible until Caleb Rowan stood still long enough to notice how people moved around him now. At the dock, a man he did not know well handed him a coil of line without comment. It was not a request. It was not a favor announced out loud. The line was simply placed within reach, as though its destination had already been decided. Caleb took it, weighed it once in his hands, then set it where it belonged. No one watched to see how he would react. Later, at the hardware store, the clerk slid a small notebook across the counter along with the receipt. "You might need this," the clerk said. Caleb opened it. Inside were measurements for the broken steps behind the old net shed. The handwriting was careful, not rushed. "I was going to take care of that," Caleb said. The clerk nodded. "You probably were." There was no suggestion that he should hurry. No pressure to perform. Caleb folded the notebook and put it into his coat pocket. When he stepped outside, the cold air felt steadier than it had earlier in the season, as if winter had decided not to surprise anyone today. He walked toward the long road that curved along the water. Halfway there, he stopped. For the first time since returning, he noticed that his steps had already chosen a direction before his thoughts followed. The town no longer felt like a place he passed through. It felt like a surface that held weight. He stood there long enough for the moment to finish on its own. Across town, Iris Calder was working through a set of revisions at her table. She adjusted the spacing between two shelves by less. Then an inch, then stepped back. The room settled. She did not look toward the window right away. When she did, she saw Caleb crossing the street below, the notebook visible in his hand. He did not look up. She returned to her work without the need to follow him with her eyes. By midday, word traveled quietly that Caleb would be fixing the steps behind the net shed later in the week. No one asked him directly. The information moved without urgency, carrying the same way tide schedules moved. At the cafe, a woman poured him coffee without asking how he took it. She placed the cup down and said, "You are here most mornings." It was a statement, not a question. "Yes," he said. She smiled once. "That works." At the far table, Iris sat with her sketchbook closed, listening to the room. She did not turn when Caleb entered. She did not need to. The sounds told her where he was. The way the chair moved. The pause before he spoke. He did not speak to her. Later, they crossed paths again at the library. Iris was returning a stack of books. Caleb stood near the bulletin board, reading notices posted without emphasis. A flyer for a winter market had been added overnight. Someone had written his name in pencil beneath a line that read, "Repairs and Setup." He read it once. He did not erase it. Iris noticed his stillness from the corner of her eye. She waited until he stepped away before approaching the board herself. She read the same line. She did not smile. When they left the library, they walked in opposite directions. The The space between them felt deliberate, not fragile. That evening, the wind shifted. Caleb closed his window earlier than usual. The sound of the ocean softened behind the glass. He sat at his table and opened the notebook from the hardware store. He reviewed the measurements carefully, checking them against his own sense of the place. They were accurate. He wrote nothing else. He did not add his name. Outside, a neighbor passed by and nodded through the window. Caleb returned the nod, briefly. It occurred to him, then, that no one had asked why he stayed. The question had not been necessary. His presence had answered itself through repetition. The realization arrived without force. Not as relief. Not as pride. As placement. Across town, Iris closed her shop later than usual. She paused at the doorway before locking up, checking the alignment of the sign one last time. It hung straight. She walked toward the water, choosing a longer route than necessary. When she reached the curve in the road, she saw Caleb ahead of her, stopped near the edge where the land sloped gently down. He was not looking at the horizon. He was watching the way the water met the shore, the consistent return of it. She slowed her pace. They stood within sight of each other for several minutes without acknowledging the shared moment. When Caleb turned slightly, she was already there. "I saw the flyer," she said. He nodded. "I saw it too." "You do not have to," she added. "I know," he said. That was enough. She adjusted her scarf against the wind. He shifted his weight, then stepped back to give her room to pass. She did not rush. As she walked on, she understood that he had not chosen a role. The town had offered one, and he had not refused it. Her respect for that choice did not require approval or distance. It required space. Behind her, Caleb remained where he was, letting the water finish its pattern. Someone passing later might have noticed the stillness and mistaken it for hesitation. It was not. It was a moment where the circle widened quietly, making room for what was already there. By nightfall, lights appeared along the harbor, steady and low. The town settled into itself without closing any doors. Caleb returned home and set the notebook on the table, exactly where he would find it again. Iris worked late, adjusting nothing more. Somewhere between those two rooms, the town held its shape, unchanged in outline, altered in use. No announcement marked the shift, only the way people moved and the way they no longer needed to look twice. Morning returned without announcement. Caleb Rowan woke before the light reached the water, the same as before. The window rattled once in the wind, then settled. He did not open it right away. He sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the surf arrive and leave, the rhythm unchanged. When he did open the window, the air carried salt and cold in equal measure. Nothing dramatic. Enough to register. The coffee took longer than usual, not because he delayed, but because his hands moved in a different order. He set the kettle down, then reached for the cup, then paused. He watched the steam rise first. Only after that did he pour. He drank standing up, facing the water. The horizon held its line. Boats moved as they always had. What felt different was the way he noticed the gaps between them. Later, he walked the long curve of the road, the one that followed the shore before turning inland. He had walked it countless times. Today, he stopped sooner, near the bend where the stones gathered after storms. A seal surfaced once, then disappeared. Caleb stayed still until the water smoothed again. He did not check the time. In town, the morning unfolded as expected. The grocery store door chimed when he entered. The woman at the counter nodded without looking up. "Bread came in early," she said. He picked up a loaf and placed it on the counter. The exchange required no further words. Outside, a man was already working on the steps behind the net shed. Caleb noticed the new boards, the clean-cut edges. He did not approach. He walked past, storing the detail without comment. The library opened 10 minutes later than posted. Caleb waited on the bench across the street, reading nothing. When the door finally opened, the librarian raised a hand in acknowledgement. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and varnish. Caleb returned a book he had not finished. He placed it carefully on the desk. "No rush," the librarian said. "I know," he replied. He did not select another book. Across town, Iris Calder unlocked her space and stood just inside the doorway. The room looked familiar, but the weight of it had shifted. The shelves she had adjusted days earlier held steady. Light moved across the floor differently now, catching edges she had not planned for. She set her bag down and did not open it. Instead, she walked through the space slowly, touching nothing. The work had already settled into place. There was nothing to correct. Later, she stepped outside to check the alignment of the window display. From there, she could see the street and part of the road beyond it. Caleb passed without stopping. He did not look toward the shop. She noticed the change in his pace, subtle but clear. He moved as though the path no longer required negotiation. She returned inside and closed the door. At midday, rain came briefly, more mist than weather. It darkened the wood along the dock and softened the sound of footsteps. Caleb adjusted his route, cutting through an alley he rarely used. The post office door was open. He stepped inside and checked his box. It was empty. On the way out, someone held the door for him. Caleb nodded once and continued on. In the afternoon, he sat at the small table near his window and wrote 2 lines in a notebook. Not plans, measurements. He closed the book and set it aside. The town moved around him, unchanged in outline. Evening arrived quietly. Lights came on in familiar places. The bar filled halfway, then emptied again. Caleb passed it without entering. At home, he cooked simply. He ate without distraction. When he finished, he washed the plate and dried it immediately, returning it to the same shelf. Across town, Iris closed her shop earlier than usual. She stood outside for a moment, watching the street thin out. The work was done. The space remained. She walked toward the water, choosing a route that crossed the road Caleb had walked that morning. She arrived after the tide had shifted, after the stones had settled again. She stood where he had stood, noticing the same horizon, the same steady return. Neither of them marked the day as different. Yet when night settled over Maine, the routines continued with a quiet adjustment. Same places, a different sequence. Nothing resolved, nothing undone. Only the sense that the order had changed and would hold. Night settled into the town without ceremony. The harbor lights came on one by one, reflected in water that barely moved. Boats rested against their lines. The sound of halyards tapping slowed as the wind eased. Maine remained where it had always been, steady and unremarkable to anyone passing through, precise to those who stayed. Caleb Rowan walked the familiar stretch near the water after dusk. Not far, not for long. His pace matched the length of the dock, then stopped at its end. He rested his hands on the railing, looking out until the horizon dissolved into darkness. No signal was given, no decision announced. He turned back when the cold reached his wrists. Across town, Iris Calder finished locking her door and checked the window once more. The display held. The light inside softened the glass just enough. She did not adjust it further. She stepped back, satisfied with its quiet balance, then turned toward home. They did not cross paths again that night. The town carried on. A late delivery truck passed through. Someone laughed briefly outside the bar before the door closed. A porch light flicked off along the curve of the road. These things happened whether anyone noticed or not. By morning, the routine would return. Coffee brewed. Windows opened. Doors unlocked. The order would look the same from a distance. Yet inside that order, small placements had shifted. The weight of silence had changed. Space was no longer something to move through alone. Nothing had been claimed. Nothing had been resolved. What remained was simple. A man choosing to stay without needing to explain why. A woman finishing her work and allowing it to stand. A town that neither asked nor resisted, only made room in the way it always had. Belonging did not arrive as an answer. It appeared as permission already granted. The coast kept its line. The road kept its curve. People kept their places not fixed but held. Somewhere between the water and the shops, between what was said and what was left untouched, the town continued. And for now, that was enough. The light stayed on a moment longer. The harbor breathed. Anyone passing through could move on. Anyone who stayed could remain quietly until morning came again.